Hello, welcome to episode number 32 of the Kentico Rocks podcast, the podcast about all things .NET, Kentico, and Azure. Today's episode is going to be all about .NET and what's new in the .NET world. And actually, I'm going to end up with a little bit of things for .NET developers in the content world who use Kentico Kontent to develop their apps with maybe .NET tooling or the .NET SDK, which is something you might be super useful to do if you're using Kentico Kontent in the .NET world. Some updates that matter and some things that you should look into because there's new versions and there's just new things that have come out in the last couple weeks to months by the content team. So again, we're going to cover what's new in .NET and what's new in content for .NET developers. Today, you're going to be stuck with just myself. You know, this is a topic that's kind of passionate to me, and I just thought I would get through and tell you some things that excite me as a developer. You know, so no guest on today's show, but we'll get to that in the next one, which I'm actually excited about as well. That should be coming out really quickly after this episode. But let's dive right into what's new in .NET. As I said, it's early June. We just hit a little bit past May, and the biggest thing of the Microsoft calendar year event-wise just kind of happened for .NET developers. And that was Microsoft Build. And that's really the motivation for this podcast. And actually a blog post that I created recently at McKeiver.com, in case you haven't seen that yet. It's something that, you know, the build event is what's new in the .NET space, what's the future look like as we're moving to the different platforms and features of the most modern .NET technologies. It's really, you know, the culmination of all the effort that's went in the last 6-8 months with Microsoft's development teams, and it sets the stage for what this year would look like in the .NET world if you want to be on the leading edge of technology. And that's something that usually gets developers excited, including myself. So it's kind of why I thought I'd talk about it. So, you know, I know a lot of people in the Kentico space, or developers, I should say, they did watch the event. I've talked to a few of them on Twitter and various channels and Slack and things like that. And, you know, the event itself, it was different this year. Normally it's an in-person event, and you would travel there, you'd see the sessions, you'd have a lot of hallway conversations with people you know, and that's a super amount of value. But with today's world and what's going on, that didn't happen. It was all virtual. I think the benefit of being virtual with MS Build is the fact that, you know, you didn't have to have such a strong commitment in terms of the resources you had to put to it. No travel, no really entry fee to get in. So this year, I think more people watched the recordings. And in case you didn't watch them or didn't know about MS Build 2020, you can actually sign in to mybuild.microsoft.com and actually see all the events or the sessions that were recorded. That's one thing that's awesome about the way Microsoft does this is they pretty much always make the recorded sessions available after the event. So you missed an announcement about what's going on with Blazor or missed some of the new things in Azure, especially with Azure Static Web Apps or other tooling that happened with Azure. That's a great way to go look at it and consume it. You can watch it in your leisure. You can hit one session a day for a week if you want to catch up. Trust me, there's a lot in there. I mean, hundreds of sessions probably are actually in there from the 3 or 4 days that they did this event. So I would encourage you to check that out if you're in the .NET space and you didn't know about Build or didn't have a chance to actually watch it on the end of the month in May. Go check out mybuild.microsoft.com, and you just need a Microsoft account to sign in. And actually, I caught a couple sessions, not as many as I wanted to. And the nice thing was I was able to recap and watch some of them. So, you know, the couple of strong things in there for me for what's new in .NET is the fact that Blazor is ready for production. You know, Blazor WebAssembly is the name they're going with because that's the technology that it's built with. And I actually have another podcast and blog about that, so I'm not going to speak too much about it today. The other thing that was big for me that got me excited was the release of Azure Static Web Apps. So I am going to talk a little bit about that and the fact that static web apps are something that it's new, and it kind of starts lining Microsoft up fairly well, even though it's still a .NET world, with Jamstack. And you've heard me talk about Jamstack on the podcast before. It's a really popular technique, and I think it is the future of the web. I think it's where we're going, and it's nice to see Microsoft align with those goals. You can basically now take your static HTML site, no matter how you generated it, or you can think of it as a SPA app, you know, like with the various JavaScript framework like Angular or Vue or React or however you want to do that. Even use Gatsby.js, which you've heard me talk about in this podcast before. So that's the thing that actually got me the most excited. And I'm going to speak about that a little bit in today's episode. But I also want to make sure the other topic of the episode is really clear. Is like, we'll get past some of the new .NET stuff, but the other thing that's happening that just happened to kind of coincide is in May, Kentico kind of updated the developer relationship team updated a new version of the .NET Delivery SDK, and there's a new best practice document for .NET developers on how to use the new SDK, the new features, and actually just in general how to best consume the delivery API if you're using content. So I'm going to have that as my second goal. So again, we're talking about Azure Static Web Apps first, and then we're going to get into the new .NET SDK for the delivery side of things. So let's dig into static web apps. If you're watching the screen, actually, on my blog post about this topic, I call out to Blazor and .NET 5 is coming out, and I have a whole other blog post about that as well, and static web apps. So in case you're want to find links, that's a good place to check it out at McKeiver.com. It's my latest blog post. But in there, you'll see that I've got a link to kind of the main way to get started with Azure Static Web Apps if you wanted to host a static site that you've built. And Microsoft has a really great documentation portal now. And one of the things I appreciated about it is it's not just documentation, it's actually like really focused on tutorials and getting started and how to do things quickly. And the thing that they launched with the preview version of the web apps in Azure is the documentation and tutorials on how to get started. So it's kind of nice. You can actually follow right along, like it was like the day after the event that all this was already there, or might have even been there the day of. And this tutorial is a great place to start if you're not sure, or if you are a seasoned JavaScript developer or a static HTML developer, even Gatsby developer, I guess. You could publish your assets right to this new hosting service that's a resource in Azure that's meant for static web apps. And it's a little bit more than that. That's what I've learned. So I didn't quite do this tutorial. I had a real world project that I needed to get done quickly last week. And it's something that my marketing team came up with, some static HTML that they wanted to publish. And they asked me to push it to our server, and I was going to do that, but then I remembered, like, hey, there's this new resource for us. So I actually went through and did this in a real world scenario. So I created an Azure resource for the static web app. It's in preview still. The cool thing about that is it's free right now. There's literally no cost at all to do this. So I was like, hey, why not? Why not do this? If I have to publish some static HTML out to a website for our company and one of our projects that we want to get done very quickly as kind of an MVP approach. So, I went to the Azure portal, I created a new resource, picked static web app, and I ended up at a screen that looks like this if you're watching the YouTube feed. It basically gives you that kind of deployment resource that you can tie a GitHub repo right to the resource. And every time you make a commit to a specific branch, you like your master branch, you can have continuous integration, continuous deployment set up that it just pulls that from your repo, updates the resources in here at the static web app, and it's out and live to the world. And I thought that would be super easy to do, and I thought that's about all it did. But what I was surprised at is static web apps in Azure do a little bit more than just actually connect to a repo and serve it. That would be something that you could use GitHub pages for, Netlify, you could do tons of things with that. But I think static web apps are a little bit more. So if you're into the .NET space, I would definitely recommend checking them out if you're doing anything that doesn't fully need a full working .NET application yet. Because again, we're kind of, in our project for BizStream, we're just stepping through this as an MVP. We want to get something out there that could generate some web pages, maybe collect a lead, and see and test this idea. So we did that. We pushed it to a repo. I've got it connected. And the thing that I noticed right away is that static web apps come with Azure Functions. So I didn't know that getting into it, but basically you can create JavaScript-based Azure Functions to create an API endpoint for your static web app and tie it right to the static web app right inside of here. Now, I'm not going to spend time on that in today's podcast episode because that actually would probably be a lot and just enough to be its own episode. Maybe later we'll get to it. But what was more interesting to me is we actually had a project. This project for this website needed to tie to an application we built very quickly. So funny enough, we actually have a Kentico Experience application behind this marketing site. And one of the challenges I had was I needed to have routing to be able to determine special URLs to go to the application. That's the Kentico Experience application-based setup that we have, or stay on the marketing site. And I was like, man, I don't have a server. This is serverless. How would I do that? I didn't even know that. Think through like, I can't just write like an IIS rewrite file, which is something that you would do as a normal .NET developer. And it turns out the Azure Static Web App team is already ahead of me. They've done this. So it's kind of neat. It's a little bit buried in the documentation, but if I switch over to my code, there's actually a routes.json concept. And this is kind of cool because it's a little bit like a rewrite file that just works. And as long as it's in the root of your code base, and it's literally called routes.json, you have the ability to say, at this route, I want to serve this HTML file, and should it be a 301 or 302? So you can have an array of routes in your JSON object, and at the end of the day, you can fall back to a custom 404 or other custom 500 or something like that for platform overrides, as they call it. So it's really interesting, and I can't say this is a best practice, but this is just me trying to get it done really quickly, is I wanted to have control over every single URL. If it wasn't found in the marketing site, I actually want to push that into our application because we're allowing multiple companies to sign up for this application, and it might be /BizStream or /Microsoft or /whatever, and I didn't want the website to handle that. I wanted our application to handle that. So I'm actually doing a little bit of a hack and relying on the not found override in Azure Static Web Apps routing to push me to a file where I then detect what the URL is and do some special things. And I'll skip that for now, but just know that one other feature of Azure Static Web Apps is this routing. Currently, it only supports relative routing inside of its routes. I wish it would support absolute routing, so because I want to push it to actually a whole different domain at sometimes. But maybe they'll get to that eventually. Again, this is just a preview of Azure Static Web Apps. But that feature was already in there, and there's a couple other hidden gems in there as well. There's environments and different things. So, basically, whenever I make a commit, and as long as I have a page, I can actually get my website in Azure Static Apps running, which actually looks like this at simcheck.io. We actually made a COVID-19 symptom checker for companies here in West Michigan, but that's a whole other story. And this is the marketing site powered by my Azure Static Web App to do that. So if I hit, the index.html, everything works because that file exists inside of the Static Web App. But if I go to /new company or something like that to sign up, or maybe an employee needs to use a symptom checker for COVID, it's actually going to hit and redirect to our application, which probably actually isn't spun up because it's not launched yet. But again, we're just collecting leads. This is something that spins up and redirects right to the company application. So it's pretty cool to be able to do that. Again, I didn't know you could do that. And it's another reason to maybe check out Azure Static Web Apps if you want to. And actually, it loaded up, and I forgot I was logged in already, which is why it redirected me. But here's our Kentico Experience app that does COVID-19 symptom checks for companies in West Michigan, which is kind of cool. So that's Static Web Apps. That's one of the new things in .NET. Again, if you want to check out other new things in .NET, there's .NET 5. There's Blazor, there's C#9, there's a ton of stuff. There's no way we can cover it all. I definitely recommend checking out my blog post about it, checking out the MS Build site. So much going on in the .NET world that just happened, at the end of May. So it's pretty neat. But switching gears a little bit, let's talk about what's new in the content world. And frankly, there's a lot. One of the things I would like to tell developers out there who are followers of Kentico Kontent or even Kentico Experience is that the open source contributions that the Kentico team is doing are very impressive. They're constantly releasing new versions of things. They're improving the developer experience. They're improving the performance of the products. Even the products themselves have a pretty rapid pace of improvement and releases, which I think is pretty impressive as a product company that Kentico is, and it's why I'm a big fan of the company. It's why we use that technology at BizStream all the time. But to be more just specific, they recently released a best practices for delivery SDK for .NET. So whether you're new to content and a .NET developer, or you're someone who's been using it for 2 years since it's been born, kind of like myself and a few other people I know, I would think that one thing to improve your abilities with the product and even as a developer on this tool set, read this document. It actually goes into things that I didn't know about even 3 weeks ago, and things that have improved over the tooling with content. So, for instance, let's get into one of them. It's very technical. It's definitely very developer slanted and friendly, but they're basically saying you should use dependency injection in this best practice document. Don't do these other things, but do this instead. And each link of this document goes into why to do that or why it's different. So if I click, use dependency injection in this best practices for content and the delivery SDK, it's going right into like, here's the standard usage that Kentico Content now recommends for starting up with dependency injection in, say, your .NET Core or your .NET 5 or even your Blazor application in 2020. And it's actually now different than what it was in 2019 or 2018. It may look very similar if you're looking at this code. We still have our startup class. We get into our configuration and our startups, and we're doing our services, and we're adding, through dependency injection, the delivery client. And if you've used content for a while, you're pretty used to that. That's the way it always was. That's the way it was in the MVC boilerplate, even back in the MVC 5 days with this. Actually, no, I take it back. More like the .NET Core 1.1 or 2.0 days of the boilerplate for content. Well, that boilerplate is now updated because the delivery SDK is updated. And we now have more options. There's actually now a delivery options builder class, which kind of allows you to specify a few different settings for overriding just the defaults that used to be in the delivery client. And if you kind of hunted through the documentation, you could find it before, but now we have a nice fluent syntax for how to change some of these configurations and endpoints and add, a preview versus a production, or change the max retry attempts or the timing. And that's interesting, and that's great to give the developers control. But on top of that, since we now have the ability that Kentico Content has released with the newest version of the NuGet package, you can actually add multiple delivery service clients. Where before you really only ever worked off one unless you did a lot of extra work yourself. Now it's super easy to add a delivery client that's a named delivery client. And the most common example that you're going to want to do that is to have a production version and a preview version. Because before, you'd have one, and you could call both production and preview URLs, but it had the same working structure under the hood. It had the same cache settings, unless you did something special, and it was like you're pointing at one direction or the other. But now you can actually say, I want to have my production delivery API an object in my C# project, and maybe I want to have super long caching because it's production. Maybe I want to have for an hour and a half or 2 hours or 7 hours. I don't want to call back to the API. I just want to cache it. But if I'm looking at preview, you may want different options. You may want to be able to say 2 minutes, or maybe no caching whatsoever. Even though I don't quite recommend that, you might not want to, but maybe you do because it's preview and you want the latest changes. You now have the ability to do that with 2 different named objects in C#. And that's pretty cool, because I know we wanted that in some projects that we've done at BizStream in the past. And actually, since you have the named clients, another enhancement is there's now the kind of HTTP client factory support. So using the client factory to create these things, the content team has told me that it increases performance, it increases scalability and security around your app. And before, you couldn't do that as well. So that's pretty cool. And if we scroll down the example, it kind of goes into what you need to do differently. And really, it just gives you more options and more control as a developer to use the delivery SDK in a real world enterprise project where you might have multiple environments, you might have multiple URLs that these things run at, and you can kind of do that much easier than you would before. And all of that I just said is just one improvement in the delivery SDK. I mean, it's probably the main one or main 1 or 2, but the document I started with this discussion, the best practices for the delivery SDK, that's in there, right? So that's why I'm saying you need to go read that and check it out, because that is something I totally recommend for content developers in the .NET space. All right. And if you're going to do that and use some of these new things, one thing to know about is you're going to want to use the beta release of at least like version 14 of the delivery NuGet package. So it's not quite fully released to production yet, but if you look, like a couple days ago, they were working on this, and they're working on it a couple days before that, and they're pushing out beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. And I know the team over at Content, they're actually looking for feedback in the GitHub repos and some of the issues, so you can comment on trying out some of the new things. There's some other changes that they're trying out in these beta versions for I think things like how the items of a content item are responded back to your code, and how they're maybe serialized into objects, or the mapping of objects. So there's some changes around that too. But again, we're kind of running out of time for the episode, but definitely check it out. And just remember, you're going to need the newer version of the NuGet package to do that. So again, check out those related resources for content, for what's new. I do have those mentioned and kind of maybe illustrated a little bit better in my blog post. So if you scroll down about Kentico Kontent .NET 5, I get into actually, if you want to change the project you have from .NET Core to .NET 5, again, that's something that just got released. Actually, I think it was like yesterday or 2 days ago, .NET Beta 5.0 came out. And that was only like a week or two after 4.0. So the .NET 5 framework is updating very quickly as well. And again, if you're not familiar with .NET 5, that is actually basically the future version of all of .NET Core and .NET Full Framework. It's merging and converging into .NET 5. And I think by the end of 2020, it's scheduled to be released in November. That is where you should start your new projects. So luckily, you can do that because the SDKs with content are on .NET Standard, and it's supported, and it all just works. You simply have to change, as I'm showing here in my blog post, the target framework in your .NET Core app or .NET 5 app to kind of reference .NET 5, and then rebuild your packages. So I get into that a little bit. I get into the details of other things that Delivery SDK users need to know, so I would check that out. And then I talk about a few other possible new things in the .NET space, like the new versions of .NET Bot Framework and the new version of Xamarin, which is Maui, the multi-platform app UI, which is kind of interesting, but not my wheelhouse, so I can't speak to that too much. But and then I end up with just some more useful links for the documentation at Kentico Kontent is new, and for .NET people, and other samples are out there. So again, my goal today was to tell you a little bit about what's new in the .NET world, tell you about MS Build if you don't know about it, showcase a little Azure Static Web Apps, and say what's new with content if you're in the .NET space. So hope you enjoyed it. Look forward to talking to you all at the virtual Connections event for Kentico coming up in the fall of this year. But with that, I want to thank you for listening to the Kentico Rocks podcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.